to live in a free nation. Something most people believe they live under, at least as long as they reside in a developed country. When asked in what nations are people free, most would answer, the United States, France, Canada, Australia, etc. When asked in what nation are people not free, the average person would probably answer Russia, China, North Korea. Well, why are the people of, say, North Korea not free? What makes them not free? The average person would probably respond that the leader is a quote-unquote dictator. What specifically about Kim Jong-un makes him a dictator? What about Xi Jinping? Putin? Kim Jong-un currently holds around 200,000 people in torturous concentration camps for political and economic crimes, or for simply being born to the wrong parents. Death by starvation is a common sight for the average North Korean, owing to the lack of ability to participate in trade, and because the DPRK has refused foreign aid on multiple occasions. In Russia, a host of dissenters have simply disappeared, never to be seen again. And in China, the CCP is implementing a social credit system. People who do good things in the eyes of the CCP are rewarded with a higher credit score, and those who do bad things, like dissenting, are punished with a lower credit score. The higher the score, the more rights. The lower, the less. What about the slaves of the early United States? Would we call them free? Of course not. They were unable to do as they desired with their own person. Their every action was regulated by their owner. They woke up at a certain time, they ate at a certain time, they worked at a certain time in horrible, torturous conditions. So what do concentration camps, the silence of dissenters, the constant surveillance of the population, and chattel slavery have in common? What makes these policies characteristics of the non-free? In each of these circumstances, one group of people owns the other group of people. Whether that be the concentration camps in which Kim Jong-un, by decree, sends a whole group of people to go waste away in a horrific conditions with no food whatsoever, or whether that be literal chattel slavery in the early United States history, in which again every single action was regulated by their owners. Well, what about the free countries then? Is, say, Australia free, like we said? Well, in Melbourne, the state issued a decree in which people couldn't leave their homes unless given permission by the state. In France, people can't go to restaurants unless they have proof of vaccination, whether the restaurant wants to enforce the policy or not. In Ontario, police are given permission to arbitrarily stop citizens' cars to ensure they're doing a state-approved action. In the United States, now, recently, businesses that employ over 100 people will be fined if they don't require their employees to get vaccinated or receive a test once a week. Can we call these people free? We can only answer in one way if we wish to remain truthful. With a resounding no. So this video is to answer that question in its entirety, whether we can call people free that we would usually associate with free countries, the United Kingdom, United States, countries in Europe, etc. The modern state has become so unbearably tyrannical and obviously evil, and this video aims to address several reasons as to why its decree should be resisted and ignored. I am not a doctor, an economist, an ethicist, or an expert. This does not mean I do not have the authority to talk about these topics. All arguments expressed here are points arrived at in rational argument. If you want to disregard everything I say here because I don't have a degree or certificate, just skip to the end of the video in which I list people who share my view who do have the degrees and certifications, and who are thousands of times smarter than I am. After this introduction, I'm going to talk about the first section here is the hierarchy of tyranny, then the legal, economics, ethics, what's happening now, the conclusion, and then some more information. And that's where I'm going to list all those people and acknowledgments. Each section is going to be time-stamped, so you can skip around sections easily. And thanks for listening to this first rant of many, and enjoy. I have come to the conclusion in the meantime that unless you have been frequently attacked to be sexist, a homophobe, a racist, or something like that, unless you have been frequently attacked as that, then you should ask yourself if there is something wrong with you. Before we begin the analysis of the state and its evil, we must recognize who holds the power and why it remains legitimized by the populace. In order to further our analysis, we have to recognize that people employ means to reach their desired ends. That is, the reason you do things is to accomplish something. First, you have ends. So maybe one of those ends is to be presentable in some meeting. As a result, you shower the morning of. The shower is the means, being presentable is the ends. So this is not to say all means are chosen most efficiently or correctly. For example, assume you have the same ends to be presentable in a meeting. However, you choose to work out in the morning before the meeting and not shower afterward, believing that the people at the meeting will appreciate, say, your drive for exercise. Instead, you show up as a sweaty mess and hence not presentable. The exercise is still the means, although it was made in error. You, as everyone does, employed some means in the hope of reaching some ends. You act purposefully. As a result, we shouldn't be surprised when those who want to create video games apply to work in companies that create video games, or those who want to create clothing go into the fashion industry. Entering those fields are a means to an end. However, other factors can be added to the mere want to create some product. For example, if someone were to pay someone else to code software, more people may be attracted to that field as there is now a monetary reward for performing that action. In addition, if the employer were to, pay more for higher quality work, it wouldn't be surprising that those who are particularly good at coding software be attracted to said field. So, if a particular field requires someone to be good at communicating with others, it also shouldn't surprise anybody that people who are good at communicating with others enter that field. Although this concept probably seems pretty obvious to you, make sure you keep this concept in the back of your mind as our analysis continues, especially when considering this hierarchy of tyranny portion and the section on economics. So, to start the construction of a model, first, we start with the scale of tyranny. Those at the very bottom of the scale are unwilling to use power over their fellow man for any reason, while those at the top are more than eager to force their fellow man to submit to their will. So in essence, at the very top are those most willing to be totalitarians, and at the very bottom are absolute pacifists. In this video, we are not interested in describing the psychological reasons as to why some are more willing to use force. We simply recognize that this difference exists. With a scale to compare groups of individuals on, we can add the block that consists of the populace. This initial group contains all sorts of people, but it adheres to the scale or spectrum of tyranny as described. So at the moment, everyone from your extended family to police officers to members of the IRS lies somewhere within this blob, based on their willingness to use force against peaceful people to achieve their ends. Although we cannot entirely separate a group from this mass, we can label some arbitrary group near the top the cultural tyrants. These are the most willing to use force against their fellow man to achieve their ends. Whether they actually have legitimate power, however, is another question. Additionally, we can separate a group towards the bottom of the mass, the non-complicit. These are those least willing to use force against their fellow man to achieve their ends. They wish to engage on a peaceful and voluntary basis with others. The group in the middle is what is known as the majority. So you might ask, if the cultural tyrants actively attempt to gain power over others and the non-complicit actively resist the tyrant's control because of their own beliefs in tyranny and force over others, where does that leave the majority? Well, they're passive submitters to the ruling elite, whoever that may be. It could be the non-complicit, it could be the majority, it could be someone leaning towards the non-complicit, it could be someone leaning towards the cultural tyrants. But throughout history, the elite have been the cultural tyrants. This does not mean the elite need to be within this group, however, but as we'll see later, they're rewarded for it. So how do these groups act? Well, you can see them in your everyday life. But let's start and focus on the cultural tyrants, as they tend to be the drivers of power. These are people who support the state and force in its entirety. They believe strongly in immaterial concepts like the common good, the collective, and, as is most favored today, the society. They believe that any harm done to the society is a risk, if not direct harm to their own person. They directly associate with the society. Martin Luther King Jr., who is greatly revered by many of these people, represents this concept perfectly with his quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." A threat to anyone within the society is a direct threat to them and their person. To them, the state is the representation of the society. They rationalize this representation in a variety of ways, with the two main lines of reasoning being, 1, they declare the state and the leader is or represents the people, or 2, they declare the state is the representation of the people when they vote. Now, both of those points are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, they often go together and they're merged. As we'll see here, Benito Mussolini once said, "Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." You have Kim Jong-il, who was the dictator of North Korea before he passed in 2011, I believe. In their day, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin represented the aspirations and demands of the exploited working masses, and the cause of socialism was inseparably linked with their names. And then, more so, in U.S. terms, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not a president and senators and congressmen and government officials, but the voters of this country." And then you have the great Abraham Lincoln with the phrase, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts." So, as these quotes illustrate from these very, very famous and revered people, those who go against the state go against the society. Those who do not submit to the will of the state goes against their very being, as a threat to the society anywhere is a threat to the society everywhere. The grand majority of these people are incapable of rational argument. As a wannabe hive mind does, the individuals within this group outsource their thinking to others, and they repeat their accepted viewpoints ad nauseum. Further, if a cultural tyrant was born in Nazi Germany, they would turn their Jewish neighbor in and pat themselves on the back. This does not mean they are inherently Nazis. This does not mean they really care about that ideology in any way. What it means is they're going to listen to whoever's in charge because they love force. Today, the cultural tyrant can be found on the college campus, threatening suspension to the student who let their mask droop below their nose. They can be found at the grocery store, donning double or even triple masks. They can be seen on Twitter repeating the same brain-dead phrases over and over and over and over again, while believing they're so intelligent. For example, take the phrase "get fucking vaccinated" or some variant of it. I'm sure you've heard it at some point. I went to search for this phrase on Twitter to get examples, and this was the suggested search bar. As you can see here, all these very creative and clever people. But here's some actual tweets. And there's a bunch on the screen right now, but I want to focus on a few of them. Friendly reminder to get fucking vaccinated. Yeah, thank you, Beck. I'm glad you're going to tell me to get vaccinated. And then you have Titus. This guy's a comedian, apparently. "I want you to come to my shows. I want you to be vaccinated. Don't come to my shows if you aren't. If science, facts, and evidence don't sway you, you are too fucking stupid to get my jokes. Enjoy." Here's some on horse dewormer, which is referring to the drug approved for humans, ivermectin. But here, this one's a 2-for-1. "Don't be a dumb piece of shit and take ivermectin. Just get fucking vaccinated so we can move the fuck on from COVID. Tired of dumb motherfuckers holding the rest of us back." And then you have the person, screenshot it. "How are we going to be able to explain climate change to a group of people who think horse dewormer is safer than the FDA-approved vaccine?" Ivermectin is a horse dewormer product. It's not meant for humans in order to treat COVID. How the hell does a sane person wake up one day and think, "Man, I should take horse dewormer for a virus"? And here's one. This is my favorite. It summarizes these people's attitude perfectly. "I stand with Nikki." Checks notes. And her new alliance with the ivermectin-snorting, horse dewormer, bleach injection, hydroxychloroquine-taking, I'ma-do-my-own-research mark of the beast believing nonsense. But there's more. So speaking of I do my own research, Gabriel Morales says, unless you have a lab at home, with state-of-the-art scientific instruments needed to deal with and test infectious diseases, a support staff around you, and specialization in immunology, public health, microbiology, it's not research, it's browsing. So I wonder, Gabriel Morales, do you have state-of-the-art scientific instruments needed to deal with and test infectious diseases? Or a support staff around you, or specialization in any of those things you mentioned? My guess is not, and you're at least missing one of those. Now, I don't know you, maybe I'm completely wrong here, but if you are missing any of those, what do you do? Just look at the first thing you see? Or do you only trust very specific people? Then you have these geniuses. I got the vaccine the minute I was allowed. I would never do my own research. I failed 11th grade biology 3 times. That's a joke, whatever. But then the person responds, I do my own research equals, I'm going to keep looking for a scientist who will affirm my political beliefs. So I wonder, does Mayonnaise Society just look at the first thing he sees and says, oh, this is true? Or does he look at the public science and say, oh, this must be the truth then, because it's the public science? These people have no concept of what the individual is. That's why they're so surprised when anybody expresses any form of individuality. And you've heard of the Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder-esque liberal destroyed thumbnails, I'm sure. Well, someone at some point made a joke that conservatives only act to own the libs. I'm sure the first time it was said, it was, somewhat funny or clever or whatever. I don't know. But as these people do, they repeat the phrase over and over and over again, so even if it was funny at one point, it no longer is. But these people believe they're so clever and hilarious that they continue to say it. So here's a good one. Florida is the only state in the nation that did not apply for $820 million in federal food aid that would benefit 2.1 million children in low-income homes. DeSantis is making children go hungry to own the libs. He has to be voted out. When people risk hospitalization and death to avoid government control and own the libs, even as all the death and dying is easy to see, when they prefer being a member of a death cult, I don't yet see how they can be saved. So, Nicki Minaj has gotten into some establishment trouble lately. If you haven't heard, she made a tweet about how her cousin's friend took the vaccine and how his balls swelled up, apparently. She called it #Ballgate. So she told people to think about taking the vaccine. She didn't say, don't take the vaccine. She didn't say, the vaccine did this to him. She said, think about it. People were super shocked that she would advise people to be individuals, because again, these people don't know what the individual is because they have no capability to be one. Tucker Carlson reported the incident on his show, saying that people don't like her remarks because she's recommending people to be individuals. So Nicki tweeted this, which is basically, she's saying, his point is accurate. Here's how the intellectuals responded. Why are you sharing something from a domestic terrorist? Ask him what he thinks about the people of Trinidad, and then what is his position on allowing more immigrants from there into our country illegally, but hoping to become a citizen. He's just using you for his base. Sorry, true. Please have it taped. Thank you in advance. And then you have the biggest intellectual, the person that you would immediately go to if you had any worries about, any scholarly problems, anything that you needed somebody of great intellect to respond to. He says something to Nicki Minaj, and he says, he's a white nationalist, right? So notice how Nicki Minaj didn't say she supported Tucker Carlson in any way, just that his statements about her were accurate. So these people, of course, as any rational person would, respond with Nazi. They broadcast their submission status for everyone so they can signal their intelligence with shirts and signs like these in the real world and not just in Twitter. Look at this beautiful shirt. The earth is round, vaccines work, we've been to the moon, climate change is real, humans have evolved, follow the evidence, embrace science. And then I'm sure you've seen these signs around here. They're all over the place if you drive down certain neighborhoods. You see things like hate not welcome here. But Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything. Ultimately, though, what's their message? Submit, submit, submit. And if you're skeptical that the state is pushing these messages, and maybe you think, the state cares about the public health because they're elected by us. Well, here's one example specifically. Here's Justin Trudeau just the other day, the Prime Minister of Canada.
We're paying for the provincial vaccine passports to make sure that when someone comes into a restaurant, they'll know they won't be sitting beside a table of people who are unvaccinated. When you go into a gym, when you go to a movie theater, you need to know that if you've done the right things, you get to be safe. You get to be rewarded for having done the right things. That's what it's all about. And those people who still hesitate, who still resist, well, they won't get to enjoy the same things that those who've done their part for others. It seems like a very logical thing. It seems like a very obvious thing.
So he's just coming right out and saying it. One of the worst parts of this group, though, is their control of the corporate press. They're represented in the media, distributing their own powerful narratives to the populace. Hell, a whole video could be done on the evil nature of the corporate press, but for now I can only focus on a few here. So let's look at this. Here's two articles, one from CNN, the other one from NBC, talking about how the lockdowns have sent pollution plummeting. Now, these news companies couldn't possibly be suggesting that we impoverish a whole bunch of people in order to keep pollution rates low, could they? No, there's no way. Oh, and remember, there was this kid, his name was Nick Sandman, back in 2019, back in that faraway land. He got in trouble because there was this video that came out of a Native American beating a drum in the kid's face. So a whole bunch of news companies jumped on that story. And you've got stories from the Daily Beast, like Covington High apologizes for students who mocked Native American veteran during March for Life. Native American leader of Michigan, mob mentality in students was scary. Video Kentucky students, mocking Native American man draws outcry. And then you have these great tweets like, I want Nathan Phillips to be the only name that's remembered from today's ugliness. Nathan Phillips, not the horde of bland, frightened, forgettable kids who will grow up to be bland, frightened, forgotten adult wastes. Nathan Phillips. Now, of course it turns out what they reported on didn't actually happen. Essentially, Nathan Phillips, the Native American man who walked directly into the kid, they didn't block him in any way. They weren't mocking him in any sense. It was very hectic. It was all Nathan Phillips' fault. He continued to bang a drum in this kid's face purposefully because he was wearing a MAGA hat. If you look further into that tweet, you see Vietnam veteran. So what happened from that too was a bunch of news articles started quoting that he was a Vietnam veteran. Oh, he's not actually one. Here's even Snopes saying that it's not true. But Snopes has it as unproven. But if you look at the What's True, it says, he said he served as a Vietnam Times or Vietnam era veteran, and that's why all the news media, they screwed it up because they accidentally misinterpreted it. It was a mistake, but it was an honest one, right? But let's check out this video of Nathan Phillips on video.
63 that day, February 22nd, last year. And I was thinking, it wasn't exactly how I wanted my birthday to be. You know, it really wasn't. I'm a Vietnam vet. You know, I served in Marine Corps 72 to 70.
So this was from 2018 of him saying that he is a Vietnam veteran, literally, word for word. But this Snopes article says, as of this recording, that it is unproven. But no way a fact-checking agency could ever lie. They ignore actual humanitarian crises while criticizing the withdrawal of support from those humanitarian crises. So basically what I'm going to show you here is a bunch of news articles from Yemen. Or about Yemen, rather. So there's a bit of a background on Yemen here. Basically, there's a civil war going on there. The forces fighting the Houthis are backed by Saudi Arabia and, by extension, the U.S. Saudi Arabia has surrounded the area in which the Houthis, which is the rebel force essentially in Yemen, and hundreds of thousands of civilians with blockades preventing food and aid from entering. So instead of focusing on the 100,000 children starving to death, because of U.S. help, this is what they're reporting on. So if you look at this article published in 2017, which is after the humanitarian crisis was officially published and known about, Who are the Houthis and why are we at war with them? It says, the Houthis have made fighting corruption the centerpiece of their political program, at least nominally. So they're very clearly trying to paint these rebels out to be these horrible people, whether they are or not what I'm saying. But notice how they don't care about reporting on the people starving to death because of the United States, or at least partially because of the United States. This is a great one too. If Yemen's Houthis weren't Iranian proxies before, they could be soon. So, and this isn't to say there were no news stories about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, because there were, and if you look, they exist. But there sure as hell haven't been enough. Especially when compared to all the stories about Afghan withdrawal. So, let's see it. Biden decides to carry out his withdrawal in Afghanistan, a 20-year-long war that has resulted in nothing. So let's see how the press responds. Well, of course, CNN, who has backed Biden every aspect so far, now goes against him and fact-checks him, saying that Al-Qaeda's still there. If you look at the conversation piece, you can see, and I'm sure you've seen this picture before, of a whole bunch of people being packed into these cramped airplanes so that they can leave. All these refugees. Where are they going to go? They're all deposed because the Taliban took over and the U.S. left. You've got the Taliban tell working women to stay home from the BBC. Biden says Afghanistan evacuation on track to finish by August 31st deadline as threats to Kabul airport grow. The Afghanistan withdrawal a stupid plan that armed Taliban with U.S. weapons and abandoned allies. Former staff sergeant. Do you not see that these people are trying to paint a picture here? They don't want to leave, and they know they don't want to leave, yet they will not report on what's happening in Yemen. They are drawing up a bigger firestorm for leaving a 20-year-long war that had killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But yet, when you've got hundreds of thousands of children starving to death because the United States was aiding Saudi Arabia, these people, and there's a few news stories, but nothing like this. They help lie the United States populace into supporting a war that resulted in the mass murder of hundreds of thousands, and that I'm referring to Iraq. I can't get into this example in its entirety, because it could be a whole video, but I can mention a few things. So essentially, back in, at this point, I think this was 2008 when this headline was made, secret U.S. mission hauls uranium from Iraq. So basically they were saying, look, we succeeded, there were WMDs here. Well, the uranium that was hauled from Iraq was yellow cake uranium, so this ore hasn't been refined, and it's completely useless until it's refined. Iraq didn't have the capability to even refine the ore, but they're running this story anyway to run cover for the federal government. At the time, this was 2002, so the aluminum tubes that they found may have Iraq link. Aluminum tubing sent from China to Jordan may have been destined for Iraq to be used in enriching uranium for atomic weapons. Yeah, well, it turns out they're not for nuclear weapons, and literally could not be used for them. An INR analyst said that if Iraq wanted to use them as tubes for uranium centrifuges, he said, we should just give them the tubes. They weren't meant for the centrifuges, yet they ran this story anyway. Now here's another one. This isn't from the corporate press in any way. This is just a journal that was published, the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. Nothing small, that's for sure, but nothing that, the average citizen may look to. But this was used in speeches. It says the anthrax evidence points to Iraq. Except the UN showed in the 1990s that Iraq's anthrax had already been destroyed. So, now that I've gone over a bunch of instances about blatant lying and deceit from these people, let's go for another example of the cultural tyrants being absolutely horrible. Watching this might be worse for some of you, and it was for me, than everything I've talked about so far.
I hope you had a relaxing Labor Day. It was not a fun Labor Day weekend COVID-wise. The number of new cases is up more than 300% from a year ago. Dr. Fauci said that if hospitals get any more overcrowded, they're going to have to make some very tough choices about who gets an ICU bed. That choice doesn't seem so tough to me. Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
So, according to Jimmy Kimmel, if you don't submit, you shouldn't receive health care. So this raises another question. If Jimmy Kimmel is saying that you shouldn't get health care, I wonder what the great and not washed up at all satellite radio host Howard Stern has to say about this. Well, he says, when are we going to stop putting up with the idiots in this country and just say it's mandatory to get vaccinated? Fuck them. Fuck their freedom. I want my freedom to live, he said. I want to get out of the house already. I want to go next door and play chess. I want to go take some pictures. This is bullshit. And of course, this is reported in CNN. So, to him, his choice to not participate in daily life is someone else's fault. If you don't submit, you will be forced to. Clearly, these cultural tyrants exist, and they view the non-complicit as either evil or as idiotic peons. They tend to believe those who refuse vaccination, for example, are Trump-supporting redneck conspiracy theory nuts who dropped out of high school. They do not attempt to understand any counter-arguments, and, as a result, should not be engaged with on a rational basis. Okay, this is all fine, but where does that leave us? Well, for one, we've established some of the ends of people, notably the ends of the cultural tyrants. Power. As a result, they search for a means to those ends. Does there exist a tool in which one group of people has power over others? Yes. The state. So, we can begin to pull people from the hierarchy of tyranny and place them in the state apparatus, with the vast majority of them being from the cultural tyrants by virtue of the state's abilities. Now, the cultural tyrants are no longer just cultural. They are real. We understand how they behave, we understand how they act, and, most importantly, we understand how they treat others. Do you want these people on Twitter to be able to dictate public health? Do you want the corporate press, who has lied in favor of mass murder campaigns, to be able to have a say in your personal life? The real tyrants actively tyrannize their subjects and beat them into submission. They are the true enemies of liberty, and thus, of the individual. Submit or you'll get hurt, they say. When you don't, submit or you'll die, they say. When you still don't do that, submit or we'll stop you from doing the things you love. And say you don't submit. Submit or we'll stop you from doing anything at all. And you still don't submit. Their last step is submit or we'll make you. To finish this section, I find this quote by the great Hans Hermann Hoppe particularly applicable. What is ruining our societies morally and economically, driving us ever closer to the abyss, is not too little tolerance, but too much. Should I be tolerant of the cannibal who wants to eat me? To the communist who wants to expropriate my property? To the socialist who wants to tax away half of my earned wealth and income? To the Democrat who seeks to disenfranchise and impoverish me through the ballot? I hardly think so. There, indeed long before that point, my tolerance has an end. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. Prior to this section, I have to clarify a few personal positions I have. For one, I am not in favor of the existence of the Constitution. As a result, the purpose of this section is not to legitimize that document, but to show how the state's promises of ensuring liberty are obviously deceitful. This section could be interpreted as the conservative, libertarian-leaning, or socially liberal and fiscally conservative perception of the Constitution. From my experience, those who would use these terms to describe themselves support the Constitution, believing that the document is 1. A beneficial document that limits the state, and 2. Currently being infringed upon, but is an ideal that can be reached. The counter I would propose would have to be, and may be, in their own video. I neither believe the document is beneficial, nor do I believe that the state can or would adhere to the Constitution, even if it were. Again, though, this section is not to prove that the Constitution is harmful. It is not to prove the utopian nature of limited government, but to suggest it. It is to prove that the state is in constant violation of its own limiting documents. To begin, we have to review a bit about the Constitution. I'm sure most of you are familiar with at least some of early American history, but for the sake of context, I'll have to summarize. The United States was in the middle of a war of independence with the British Crown. After independence was declared, the Articles of Confederation were drafted to unite the 13 independent colonies against their foe, King George III. Due to the founders' circumstances and experiences with a tyrannical federal government, the Articles were intentionally drafted to be extremely weak. If you remember the Articles of Confederation, it's probably because you were constantly told that the Articles were too weak, and hence a failure. Certainly, U.S. history teachers from your impressionable years were very good at ensuring you associate government weakness with failure. If you look up Articles of Confederation, you are hammered with responses about its weakness. For example, if you look at this graphic, it has several different categories as to why the Articles of Confederation failed, quote unquote. In the economics section, the first thing you see is Congress did not have the power to tax. You see things like no executive branch to enforce any acts passed by Congress, no national court system, and no standing army. Now here's a couple Google suggestions. These were labeled under different questions in the FAQ section of the Google suggestions that it gives you, but they give the same information and they're on 2 different dates and 2 different websites. Very weird. But both of them, notice how the second entry is Congress did not have the power to tax. This is very important for them hammering into your head that government weak, government does not have power to tax, government failure because government have no power to tax. This is hammered into your head from when you're very young. And if you look at the key points here, that this was also a suggestion. Under the Articles, the U.S. economy faltered since the central government lacked the power to enforce tax laws or regulate commerce. Again, this is constantly brought up over and over and over again in order to hammer this into your head. Your education probably consisted of hearing about the Articles of Confederation, being told they were a weak, ineffective failure, and that it wasn't an important document to review. Much more important to them is the Constitution. Could it be that schools, which are so heavily influenced, if not entirely run by, the central state, are intentionally skipping a period in history that runs counter to their narrative? No, it couldn't be. But the Articles were weak. The federal government was unable to enforce taxes, unable to raise a standing army, and had no control over a centralized currency. Shays' Rebellion, which was a revolt about high taxes, was probably touched on to prove its weakness. Essentially, the rebellion was successful and it ended those high taxes. So the government didn't get what it wanted, and the schools that are run by the government don't teach that that was a good thing, and of course they wouldn't. The tyrants noticed the liberty people had under the Articles and acted on it. On May 14, 1787, the Constitutional Convention was called, and the tyrants began actively plotting their coup against the unanimously accepted federal government behind closed doors. On September 17, 1787, the new Constitution was ratified. On March 4, 1789, the Constitution officially took the place of the Articles of Confederation. While the Federalist goals were to establish a strong, centralized state that they could use, the Anti-Federalists were rightly skeptical. They required a Bill of Rights to be included so they could be assured that individual liberty wouldn't be infringed upon like they had just experienced under the King. After long debate, 10 amendments were drafted and approved to the Constitution. So, keeping that all in mind, we can start our analysis of some parts of the Constitution. Before we do, though, I have to state that I can't cover every single part of the Constitution, every majority opinion, every dissenting or concurring opinion, or every violation. This is just a section on a much larger video. So, the parts of the Constitution I want to highlight. Article 1, Section 8 describes the powers Congress has. There are 2 clauses I want to focus on. 1, the Necessary and Proper Clause. It reads as such. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. 2, the War Powers Clause. The Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Now I'll read a few amendments in the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment reads as follows. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. The Fourth, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The 10th, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Clearly, these amendments are very specific. They are relevant to the times, notably the 2nd, 4th, and 10th. Those three are specifically created to limit the power of the federal government, and to interpret them otherwise would be to trash the founders and their intentions. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, let's look at some of the commonly accepted rulings and deem their constitutionality. The Patriot Act was passed less than 2 months after the events of 9/11. It was marketed to the people as a matter of safety, being necessary to the national security of the country. You don't want your family to be in danger of radical Islamist terrorists, right? Although there's numerous violations of the Constitution within the Patriot Act, I'm going to focus on one, Section 215. Section 215 reads as follows. The Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation or a designee of the Director, whose rank shall be no lower than the Assistant Special Agent in charge, may make an application for an order requiring the production of any tangible things, including books, records, papers, documents, and other items, for an investigation to protect against international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities, provided that such investigation of a United States person is not conducted solely upon the basis of activities protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. Okay, sounds innocuous enough. I mean, as long as the confiscation of these personal things are to fight the terrorists. And it continues. Each application under this section 1 shall be made to A, a judge of the court established by section 103A, or B, a United States magistrate judge under Chapter 43 of Title 28, United States Code, who is publicly designated by the Chief Justice of the United States to have the power to hear applications and grant orders for the production of tangible things under this section on behalf of a judge of that court, and 2 shall specify that the records concerned are sought for an authorized investigation conducted in accordance with subsection A2 to obtain foreign intelligence information not concerning United States person, or to protect against international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities. That last part is the important part there. To protect against international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities. So, you can be spied on if the state determines the investigation is to fight the terrorists. Well, what does the Constitution have to say about this? Let's recall the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. Huh. Did Section 215 have anything about probable cause? No. Let's look at another example. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which is otherwise known as the Biden Crime Law or Bill. Well, it reads, Section 922 of Title 18 United States Code is amended by adding at the end the following new subsection. It shall be unlawful for a person to manufacture, transfer, or possess a semi-automatic assault weapon. And more specifically, it lists a bunch of different kinds of firearms that are specifically limited by the federal government through this act. Huh. What did the Second Amendment say again? A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Sorry, I think I might be missing something. Does it say, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed except for some semi-automatic firearms? No, it doesn't say that. If your reaction to that is, well, the Founding Fathers didn't have access to semi-automatic firearms, you're wrong. The Belton flintlock, as just one example, was a musket that could fire up to 16 shots in 20 seconds, and it was offered directly to the Continental Congress. So they certainly knew about it. The only reason it was turned down was because it was pretty expensive. There are plenty more examples of similarly powered firearms, but that could go in its own video. So, there goes the Second Amendment. One of the largest issues the founders were concerned with was the ability of the state to enforce its will through standing armies, which is why they were entirely left out of the Articles of Confederation. They wanted to ensure that there would be no king-like figure with the ability to whip the population into war on his whim, so they gave the power of war declaration to Congress so that, if the state wanted to go to war, it would have to go through the arduous process of going through Congress. Well, skip forward in time a bit, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, is in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. He wants to go to war with Vietnam, but Congress will not approve. Lucky for him, an innocent U.S. destroyer was shot at by aggressive North Vietnamese torpedo boats twice in the Gulf of Tonkin. This prompted Congress to pass the famous Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed LBJ to take any necessary military action he wanted. So, Vietnam occurs. A long and horrible war that ends in absolutely nothing, with no declaration. Later, what is taught as the wonderful War Powers Resolution is passed, limiting the power of the president to only be able to use military action without Congress's approval for a short period of time. It states, "The President, in every possible instance, shall consult with Congress before introducing United States armed forces into hostilities or into situation where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and, after every such introduction, shall consult regularly with the Congress until United States armed forces are no longer engaged in hostilities or have been removed from such situations." In the reporting section, it reads, "In the absence of a declaration of war, in any case in which United States armed forces are introduced into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, into the territory, airspace, or waters of a foreign nation, while equipped for combat, except for deployments which relate solely to supply, replacement, repair, or training of such forces." Now, the document continues, but those were the two most important things that I wanted to throw in there. Oh, if the president wants to deploy the armed forces, he has to report it to Congress. What about war powers, did Article 1, Section 8 say? The Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. So, all of the U.S. history teachers exclaiming that the War Powers Resolution was a good but misused act are wrong. This document gives the explicit permission to the President of the United States to impose the U.S. military wherever he wants, whenever he wants, without Congress's permission. The United States hasn't declared war on any nation since World War II. All military action has been a result of the President's actions since. Vietnam, Korea, Panama, Afghanistan, Iraq 1, 2, and the lesser-known 3, Libya, Syria, and Somalia have all been military interventions with the certification of one man. Oh, and it was all based on a lie. Let's look briefly at the war on drugs. At one point in the United States, the Constitution was taken a little more seriously. When the state wanted to ban alcohol, an amendment was passed through Congress stating the following: "After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited." This is what's known as the 18th Amendment, and it was later rightly repealed. But today, all kinds of drugs are banned for public consumption, including drugs as innocuous as weed. Maybe they passed another amendment. Can you point to the Constitution and tell me where the federal government has a right to ban weed, or any drug at all? No? Yeah, neither can I, and neither can they. But I can point to the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. But apparently the federal government can allow, restrict, and ban whatever it desires, whether the power is delegated to the federal government or not. Okay, sure. But how does the state get away with these clear and obvious violations of the Constitution? The answer to this question is not singular, but I don't have enough time to address all the ways the state maneuvers the Constitution. If you want this question to be answered in its entirety, look up Judge Andrew Napolitano. However, I can point out one very common way the state uses the Constitution to violate it: the Necessary and Proper Clause. The purpose of the clause is to say that the federal government has the ability to use what tools are at its disposal that are necessary to enforce its enumerated powers. So when it says it has the ability to tax, it can use tools to enforce the ability to tax. It is not saying that anything the government wants to do, it can do. So how could this possibly go wrong? Well, in 1819, there was this court case called McCulloch v. Maryland. Chief Justice John Marshall at the time wrote the majority opinion for the case, allowing the state to establish a single national bank. He writes, "If this limited construction of the word necessary must be abandoned in order to punish, whence is derived the rule which would reinstate it, when the government would carry its powers into execution by means not vindictive in their nature? If the word necessary means needful, requisite, essential, conducive to, in order to let in the power of punishment for the infraction of law, why is it not equally comprehensive when required to authorize the use of means which facilitate the execution of the powers of government without the infliction of punishment?" Basically, John Marshall is saying the U.S. has the ability to create a national bank without it being stated in the Constitution because of the Necessary and Proper Clause. He is saying that necessary and proper doesn't mean absolutely necessary and proper because the founders would have written the word absolutely. This argument that he puts forward is extremely disingenuous, as we can read the definition of the word necessary from the Webster's Dictionary of 1828. That must be, that cannot be otherwise, indispensably requisite. It is necessary that every effect should have a cause. And definition 2, indispensable, requisite, essential, that cannot be otherwise without preventing the purpose intended. Air is necessary to support animal life. Food is necessary to nourish the body. Holiness is a necessary qualification for happiness. Health is necessary to the enjoyment of pleasure. Subjection to law is necessary to the safety of persons and property. This has been one of the worst precedents that have been set in the United States judicial history. It has, as you can probably guess, given a golden ticket to the federal government to expand as much as they so desire. So, the state parades around a document as a symbol of liberty that has done nothing but legitimize its reign. The despicable agents of the state use the Constitution when they need to, and cast it aside when they don't. We return to the quote from Lysander Spooner used at the beginning of the video. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. So, who cares? Clearly, the state doesn't care about the Constitution in any meaningful way, so why talk about it? For that reason exactly. The Constitution doesn't matter to these people. Anybody who wants to be a free person must recognize this basic reality. The state ruins kids' lives for drug possession charges. The state commits mass murder regularly with no declaration of war. The state runs an intelligence apparatus that spies on its own citizens. The state disarms the populace, making them unable to defend themselves from its transgressions. All of these actions are explicitly prohibited by the Constitution, yet the state does them anyway. So when you get a knock on your door in the middle of the night, remember, they have no restraint. So why should you? It is infinitely better to rely on the pursuit of economic interest by landowners or street companies than to depend on the dubious altruism of bureaucrats and government officials. Before we begin diving into economics, we have to review and summarize some of the earlier established points. For one, all people have ends. People perform action, the means, to reach some goal, the ends. Actions are purposeful. Secondly, I have to state a few things about this section. For one, this is not a defense of private property or the existence of private property. This section simply describes the consequences of recognizing versus not recognizing the right to private property. This is not a defense of any ethic at all, for that matter. Again, economics describes the consequences of coercion or lack thereof between individuals. As a result, I cannot and will not make any should or ought claims in this section. I cannot explain every economic concept in this section either. Like the previous sections, there are parts of this video that can and should be further analyzed, but that would be beyond the purpose of this video. So, with these considerations in mind, we can start our analysis. To begin, let's consider the case of a man on a deserted island. Let's call him Steve. Steve, like all human beings, has ends. Steve also has a value scale which prioritizes those ends from most important to least important. For example, Steve most likely values his survival over leisure. As a result, he will pursue the higher value, survival, instead of the lower value, leisure. Steve values his survival over relaxation. Fortunately for Steve, there are plenty of berry bushes on the island. Since Steve values not starving to death over relaxing on the island, he will forgo leisure and perform labor to pick some berries. So, Steve picks and eats berries until he is satiated. Steve might even have a low time preference, so he might even continue to forgo present leisure even after he is satiated to build up a reserve of berries for him to consume at a later date, allowing him to enjoy extra leisure at that later date. Maybe Steve has some fondness for the act of picking berries, so he continues to pick berries even though the physical product is useless to him. He enjoys the act of doing it. Those are the ends. No matter the situation, Steve is employing means to reach his most valued ends. With his most valued ends settled, Steve moves on to his next most valued ends, exploration. So, Steve forgoes his leisure again and decides to explore the island. In his exploration, he finds another person. Let's call him John. John was on a side of an island with plenty of apple trees, which he picked to feed himself. John also recently decided to explore the island after he was done picking apples. So, Steve and John have a brief conversation and tell each other the food they found and gathered. After hearing of these apples, Steve's value scale is adjusted to determine his want for apples. John's value scale is also adjusted, but to instead include his want for berries. The thing each individual does not have in their possession is denoted by parentheses. So, Steve and John begin to negotiate a trade. Steve wants 1 apple more than 10 berries, while John values 10 berries more than 1 apple. As a result, an agreement is easily reached, and Steve and John trade their goods with one another with a mutually beneficial trade. Why Steve and John trade at this price is obvious. However, what if their value scales look like this? Now, John values only 5 berries over 1 apple, but Steve still values 1 apple over 10 berries. When they negotiate, Steve will refuse to trade more than 10 berries for 1 apple, while John will refuse to trade more than 1 apple for 5 berries. So instead of trading 1 apple for 10 berries, they'll trade 1 apple for 5 berries. But what if their value scales look like this? Now, John values his apples over any number of berries, whereas Steve still values 1 apple over 10 berries. Now, John will just flat out refuse to trade with Steve. Okay, now let's introduce a third person. Let's call her Sue. Sue overhears the conversation between John and Steve. Sue wants both apples and berries, but she has not gathered anything to offer. So she returns to her section of the island. There, she spends a few hours gathering firewood, then she goes back to where John and Steve were and introduces herself, telling them that she has firewood available for trade. So, John, Steve, and Sue begin negotiations, and Sue ends up trading some of her firewood for some of John's apples and some of Steve's berries. The difference between John and Steve's actions and Sue's are that Sue produced solely for the purpose of trade. She didn't, quote-unquote, consume, not literally, any of the firewood she gathered. Let's introduce one more person into the mix. Jim. Jim sees Sue gathering firewood, and he decides he can gather more in a shorter period of time. Jim also values his firewood less than Sue, allowing him to trade with John and Steve for a lower price than Sue. To illustrate this, say John, Sue, and Jim all meet and begin negotiations. For one, John values 10 pieces of firewood more than 1 apple. Sue values 1 apple more than 15 pieces of firewood. Jim values 1 apple more than 18 pieces of firewood. Since John, the consumer of the firewood, will not trade an apple for less than the firewood that they value, the negotiations will begin at the smallest amount of firewood per apple, John's desire for 10 pieces per 1 apple. So, Sue is going to offer 10 pieces for 1 apple. Jim, wanting the apple, offers 11 pieces for it. Sue offers 12. The negotiation goes on and on and on until Jim offers 16 pieces of firewood. At this price, though, Sue is no longer going to offer any firewood for apples because she does not value the apple for that much foregone firewood. As a result, Jim will trade 16 pieces of firewood for 1 apple. Jim has made a psychic profit of 2 pieces of firewood, and John has made a psychic profit of 6 pieces. The more goods and services that are introduced, the more complicated this economy becomes. So for example, how many apples should be traded for a donkey? Pears for horses? Firewood for steel? Steel for apples? The answer to all of these questions would correctly be whatever the two parties decided on, but obviously this system is extremely inconvenient. In order to negotiate price to the best of one's ability, you'd have to compare the worth of your goods to those of every other good, a feat that's practically impossible. Additionally, with the huge availability of goods in the real world, two people often do not have a double coincidence of wants. That is, one person does not want the good the other has. So for example, take John and Steve's possession of apples and berries, respectively. Sue also has firewood. Steve wants apples, John wants fish, say, and Sue wants berries. In this situation, no direct trade can take place because no two actors share any terms of negotiation. And for the sake of brevity, we will jump from this barter economy to a market economy that utilizes currency, because in this economy, instead of directly trading for goods, currency is used as an intermediary. This helps solve the conundrum of the lack of double coincidence of wants. And if you want an explanation for why or how money comes to be in more detail, I'll have to make an entirely separate video for things of that nature. Now, we can expand our view to wider society. The millions of individuals that participate within an economy all have their own value scales, just like Steve, John, and Sue. Just like Sue, a firm may arise that produces goods for the sake of receiving some other good or service without actually consuming the good they produce. So, the firm produces goods that people want. Just like the smaller producer, the firm wants the highest price it can get. So, say there's a firm that produces a good. Why would that good benefit people? Well, for one, the firm needs to get people to use the good. Since the firm relies on people using their goods for public image and reputation, the firm needs to produce something that people will use. 2. If the good directly harms people without their consent, they could be liable for retributive punishment through tort law and fraud. 3. The firm needs to get people to purchase the good. The firm's owner wants to make money from the good so that they can reach their ends and purchase other things. That's the entire purpose of starting a firm. 4. They need to make sure the costs of production are lower than the price of the good being produced, or else they'll make a loss. This goes into point 3 and will cause the firm's owner to attempt to optimize production as best as possible to appeal to buyers while using as little resources as possible. 5. Like the primitive example between John, Sue, and Jim, many other firms can produce the same goods and compete with the original producer. So, as a result of all of these factors, a firm needs to spend as little as possible on input costs while producing a high-quality product sold at a low price. As a result of all these factors, a firm needs to spend as little as possible on input costs while producing a product at sufficient quality and at a sufficient price that people will buy. Throughout this discussion, though, we focused on the voluntary interaction between individuals, or between the consumer and the firm. However, this is not all interaction, as force is something that can be used against individuals. It exists, it is real. So what happens when the firm is able to use violence, and no other firm can? Well, why bother with competitors? That firm can now limit those competitors by force. They'll give themselves the monopoly approval to produce a certain good. They'll say, I am the only firm that can produce this good. They'll create rules for entering a market that some competitors cannot adhere to. For example, they might drive up the cost of inputs arbitrarily. They may say a given firm needs 4 units of some input instead of 3, eliminating those who cannot afford a 4th. The firm will insure itself from liability, stating that it has special privilege that no other business can have. The firm will insure itself from loss by requiring people to pay some amount, depending on the size of the loss. The firm will ensure revenue by requiring people to pay it some amount of money regularly, whether they use the product or not, and the firm may even require people to use the product. Now, all of the qualities that ensure a firm is producing a good to the consumer's liking are effectively abolished. Now, the good being produced is not only a bad use of owned resources, but is a bad use of unowned resources. People who would have used or funded other products by other firms with their own resources now no longer have the funds to do so, or even the competitors to buy from, artificially skewing production away from the voluntary participants in society to the coercive, parasitic ones. Further, if a firm were to be guaranteed revenue through coercing its consumers, it wouldn't know which practices are and are not appealing to people, even if they wanted to know. Pricing, profits, and losses are mechanisms that tell a firm whether its decisions are being made efficiently. Guaranteeing its revenue through force eliminates these mechanisms. Further, if a firm were to be guaranteed revenue through coercing its quote-unquote consumers, it wouldn't know which practices are and are not appealing to people, even if they wanted to know. Pricing, profits, and losses are mechanisms that tell a firm whether its decisions are being made efficiently. Guaranteeing its revenue through force eliminates these mechanisms. So to illustrate this point, assume a given firm is a restaurant. That restaurant's environment can be anywhere from extremely dirty to spotless. If the firm participates in a voluntary market, consumers will fund the firms that they wish to eat at based on how clean they want the environment to be. The optimal cleanliness of a restaurant for a given area would be at the profit maximizing point. That is, where consumers will still dine in high enough numbers or pay high enough prices to dwarf the costs of keeping the environment sufficiently clean. Now, assume the restaurant is gaining revenue through force. People must pay to keep the restaurant running, whether the firm keeps a clean environment or not. Now, the measurement of demand through revenue is impossible. Fake prices may try to be set, but because the restaurant cannot suffer genuine voluntary loss, proper allocation is impossible. How clean should the restaurant be? How much should the restaurant spend on cleaning? The owners couldn't possibly know, since they are not receiving revenue voluntarily. Let's just assume the restaurant becomes a regulatory agency, so they still have the force. They're able to shut down firms who do not pass their level of cleanliness. However, since cleanliness isn't objective, how could this restaurant-turned-regulatory agency shut down businesses in a non-arbitrary way? They cannot, because they cannot gauge consumer demand versus cost. But in order for this all to occur, a group would have to have the sole ability to draft rules, enforce those rules, and act as the sole arbitrator in cases brought against it. Plus, this group would also have to have the sole ability to guarantee its revenue through coercion. Well, is there an entity with a monopoly on legislation, execution, and arbitration as described? Is there an entity with the ability to guarantee its revenue through force? Yes, the state. What does the FDA do but arbitrarily limit competitors from entering a business by force? How could the FDA possibly know what is or isn't preferred? They don't. They arbitrarily shut down businesses through some arbitrary metric, limiting competitors from entering an industry. What does the EPA do but arbitrarily increase the cost of businesses to run by arbitrary environmental metrics? What do patents do but give the original creator of a product the sole authority to produce said product? Does this not effectively eliminate most, if not all, of its would-be competitors? What are bank loans and corresponding bailouts from the Fed, but insurance from loss? What is taxation but the guaranteed collection of revenue through force? All of these questions apply to all industry within the government, whether that be the post office, regulatory agencies like the FDA, EPA, or SEC, the police, or the military. Most, if not all, of these also apply to corporations given subsidies, bailouts, patents, or favors by the state. But what about use? You have the choice to use the good, even if you don't have the choice to fund it. You can choose between, say, getting a vaccine and not getting one, even if the companies producing them have patents, guaranteed state coerced funding, insurance from lawsuit by the state, and history of using money from state bailed out banks. At least, at the end of the day, the state can't physically force you to use a product, right? Yeah, not anymore. So you tell me, if these companies are protected from competition through patents, they're guaranteed funds from the state, they're insured from lawsuit by the state, and they have a history of using money from banks that were bailed out, so they're insured from loss, how could you possibly trust that these agencies are producing a good that is good for you? There is no difference of principle, but only of degree, between the slavery they boast they have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery, and differ from each other only in degree. This section may be one of the most important, if not the most important, portions of the entire video. Ethics provides a set of principles. If an actor breaks those principles, they have committed some kind of wrongdoing, whereas if they do not, they have not committed wrongdoing. We must establish first that ethical principles differ from moral principles. Ethical principles describe the code of peaceful cooperation between humans and provide consequences for breaking those principles, whereas a moral code describes the adoption of some other personal code in terms of human character. So, some actions deemed immoral may be ethical, while some actions deemed moral may be unethical. For example, if you cheat on your spouse, most would recognize that you have demonstrated that you have poor moral character and have thus committed an immoral act. However, you have not violated your spouse's ownership of themselves and their things, so you have not committed an unethical act. Next, I have to distinguish positivist law, or legislation, and natural or ethical law. Unlike section 3 of this video, when I refer to law in this section, I'm referring to ethical law. That is, a set of ethical principles that apply to all humans regardless of class, race, social status, etc. So, if I were to say murder is illegal, I do not mean that murder is illegal because the state says so, but rather murder is illegal because committing murder would betray those universal ethical principles. By this definition, the state does not dictate law. To further define terms, the term legitimate describes lawful actions. That is, a legitimate action is one that does not conflict with those universal ethical principles. Illegitimate describes the opposite. Finally, I have to differentiate between the terms possession and ownership. Possession describes the state of having physical control over a thing in question, whether that possession is legitimate or not. Ownership describes the legitimate claim you have over a thing in question. Ownership does not imply possession, and possession does not imply ownership. For example, if you're alone, you have possession over the device you're watching this video over. However, how you receive this device is unknown to me. You could have bought it, been given it as a gift, borrowed it, or even stole it. As a result, I cannot conclude whether you own the device or not, although I can hope you do. However, I can conclude that you possess the device. Now that the terms used throughout this section are properly defined, we can describe the properties of an objective ethic. For one, all rights come from self-ownership. That is, all rights are derived from the fact that human beings have a property right in their own body. So, one human being cannot murder another, not because of some arbitrary right to life, but because the victim's property would be being harmed without the victim's consent. By extension, the individual has a property right in the land which he homesteads, as that thing is uniquely his. So, when an individual merges some unowned piece of land with his own labor, he forms something that becomes an extension of himself. He has homesteaded that property. As a result, he owns that property. Well, what can an individual do with a piece of owned property? well, whatever he wants, given that the activity doesn't infringe on another's property right. This includes giving his property away to others by transferring his title of ownership to another. The transfer of property from one to another without a transfer in the opposite direction is called a gift and cannot be revoked. Additionally, there are conditional gifts or partial gifts. This terminology kind of relates to the transfer of property on some condition. There is also exchange, consisting of two parties in which one transfers his title of ownership to the other on the condition that the other party also transfers his title of ownership from his respective thing. For example, say there exists a person A and person B. Person A gives person B $200. This interaction is called a gift. Say person A gives person B $200 if person B enters a contract promising to use that $200 for their school textbooks. This interaction is called a conditional or partial gift. Finally, say person A gives person B $200 if person B gives person A a textbook. This interaction is called an exchange. So, a person can gain ownership of things in three legitimate ways: homesteading, gift or conditional gift, and exchange. Although there exists only those ways to gain ownership of something, possession is another story. Since ownership does not imply possession, and possession does not imply ownership, how can someone illegitimately possess something? Well, theft. Theft is the confiscation of a thing without the owner's consent. For example, take person A and person B. Person B walks up to A and holds a gun to A, telling him to hand over $200. A obliges, and B leaves. B has stolen from A and has coerced A to hand over $200 under the threat of violence, infringing on A's owned property. B is now an illegitimate possessor of A's property. Theft can be implicit as well as explicit. That is, if a contract were to be broken, the contract breaker would be considered a thief. Take the example of fraud. Person A gives person B $200 if B gives A a new radio. B gives A a sealed box, asserting that the radio is inside. So A gives B the $200 and goes home. There, A opens the box and finds it stuffed with junk. As a result, B is the illegitimate possessor of the $200 as he broke a condition of the contract, that he transfer ownership of a radio to A. He has committed fraud. These concepts are most likely intuitive to you, as most people come to realize that murder, theft, rape, fraud, etc. are wrong. However, the reasons as to why they're wrong can now be seen in a clearer light. They're all actions performed on an unconsenting party. Now that we've established how an individual may come to possess something, we can analyze a complicated case. One in which the means used to gain possession over a thing is unknown to us. For example, take a situation in which you and two others named Henry and Patrick are stranded on a deserted island. Henry has performed some amount of labor and collected sticks, fibers, and other materials which he combined to create a crude fishing rod. Due to the principles we've established previously, we can say that Henry both owns and possesses this rod. He has a property right in the rod. Henry uses the fishing rod all day, and he retires to his crafted shelter for the night. The next day, you wake up and notice that Patrick is using Henry's fishing rod. You didn't notice any exchange, but you can't say for sure. However, knowing what you know about property rights, you can come to the conclusion that Patrick can only have possession of Henry's fishing rod if Patrick either 1. Created the rod, 2. Was given it as a gift, 3. Was given it in exchange, or 4. Stole it. However, we can further categorize these interactions. For one, options 2 and 3 are voluntary on the part of both parties. Option 4 is involuntary and illegitimate. Option 1, though, is a little more complicated. If option 1 is correct, since we know Henry created the rod, Patrick must either be Henry or own Henry. So, we determine that Patrick is either 1. Is Henry, 2. Voluntarily contracted with Henry, 3. Owns Henry, or 4. Stole from Henry. Using basic logical principles, we can eliminate the first option as a possibility, as one thing cannot be two things. It breaks the law of contradiction. For example, say Henry decides to keep his fishing rod. Patrick decides to take Henry's fishing rod. So Henry has decided to keep the fishing rod in location A, whereas Patrick has decided to keep it in location B. How can Patrick both simultaneously decide to keep something in both location A and B? Further, if Patrick is Henry, which action takes precedence? If we assume this is true, we would have to conclude that all murder is suicide, all assault is self-harm, and all sex, including rape, is masturbation. This conclusion is obviously absurd, as no two individuals are the same. In order to further eliminate options, you would have to talk to Henry. So, when Henry awakens, you ask him if he gave Patrick permission to use his fishing rod. Henry says he has not, and that Patrick threatened to harm him if Henry did not surrender the rod. Now, two options remain. Either 1, Patrick owns Henry, or 2, Patrick stole from Henry. You approach Patrick and question him about his possession of the rod, relaying the information he learned from Henry. Knowing that admitting himself as a thief would legitimize retributive punishment, he claims that he has gained the fishing rod legitimately. However, if we eliminate illegitimate possession as an option, we are left with one possibility for Patrick's possession over the rod. Patrick owns Henry. If we reach this conclusion, all of Henry's property can be legitimately taken from him, since Henry is a mere extension of Patrick. Patrick claims to have a property right in Henry. Since all of Henry's property rights are an extension of himself, and all of Patrick's property rights are an extension of himself, it follows that all of Henry's property rights are an extension of Patrick, and are thus under Patrick's control. Henry is Patrick's slave. The problem with this is obvious, as admitting slavery is legitimate contradicts the most basic principle of the human ethic, self-ownership. Although there is debate about whether a person can legitimately sell themselves into slavery while adhering to the ethic laid out, there is no debate that a person can sell another person into slavery without their permission. Since we know Henry hasn't given this permission, we can be 100% certain that Patrick's control of Henry is illegitimate. So, although legitimate chattel slavery is impossible, the term slavery will be used in this video to describe the control of one person by another. That is, when the offending party, Patrick, claims not to have committed theft, and we can be sure that there was no voluntary interaction that took place. You might have realized the conclusions that this reasoning implies. But before we explicitly state these conclusions, we have to address a few different situations. Well, for one, what happens when we replace Patrick with a group of individuals called Group P? Assume the members of Group P unanimously agree to confiscate Henry's fishing rod for whatever reason. Given the same circumstances, Group P is still the offender. Like Patrick, the members of Group P must claim to own Henry, by the same reasoning we just laid out. Well, what if the members of Group P decide through a majority vote? In this circumstance, the majority are still the slave owners. But what of the minority? The minority can only claim to be slave owners if they aid the majority in enforcing the edict against Henry. If the minority refuses to aid the majority, they are not aiding the offending party in any way and are hence not slave owners. Through these two examples, we establish that the mere identity of the offending party being members within a group does not change the offense. They remain slave owners. However, one situation remains pervasive to this day and is thought to be legitimate. What if Henry were to have a say in Group P? So to analyze this situation, we should assume that all members within Group P, including Henry, have equal voting power. That is, their input all count as one. Even in this circumstance, we can easily make the conclusion that Henry is not Group P for the same reasons Patrick is not Henry. If this were the case, we would have to conclude that the Holocaust was nothing but a mass suicide. Obviously, we cannot and will not make this conclusion. So, we're left with three similar options. Group P has voluntarily contracted with Henry, Group P owns Henry, and Group P stole from Henry. Henry, like the previous situation, claims that he only gave the fishing rod to an enforcing member of Group P because he was under threat of harm. So, Henry claims the surrender of his property was coerced and thus involuntary and illegitimate. However, unlike the previous situation, a member of Group P provides some rational pushback, claiming the surrender was voluntary. They say, since Henry had the ability to participate in the voting system, he implicitly consented to the confiscation. We must acknowledge that this reasoning is faulty. Henry did not wish to be put under the system in the first place, so when its participation was forced upon him, he refused. Imagine a slightly different scenario where Group P points a gun at Henry, telling him he can either raise his left hand and not be beaten to death, or he can be beaten to death. This is clearly a false choice foisted upon Henry by force, and Henry's outright refusal to participate can only be taken as coercion by Group P. Let's assume instead that Henry did participate in the voting system, voting to keep his things. The member claims, since Henry participated in the voting system, he implicitly consented to the confiscation. Yet again, this reasoning is dangerously wrong. Again, this comes from the false choice that is foisted upon Henry. He is effectively dropped into an arena without his consent, surrounded by other people with weapons. If he picks up a weapon to fight, did he consent to being thrown in the first place? Obviously not. If this were true, there could be no such thing as a democratic crisis against those who voted against it. For example, mass murder of a minority group would be perfectly okay, as long as the victims voted at some point. Finally, the group member claims, Henry implicitly consented because Henry lives on Group P's property. This claim seems valid on its surface, as if Henry is on Group P's property, he would have to consent to their terms or be exiled. Well, the first issue with this idea is that Group P would not be right to assault Henry if Henry refused to abide by their rules. They'd only be able to use as much force as necessary to evict him. So attempting to beat Henry into submission is still a violation of Henry's bodily autonomy, whether Henry is standing on P's property or not. If you walk onto someone's property and they say, "Oh, you must wear a funny hat on the premises," but you refuse, do they have a right to confiscate your cell phone? No, they have a right to tell you and to get you off of the premises. However, let's assume the member of Group P defending their actions concedes this point, but continues to insist that Henry be exiled if he does not give up the fishing rod. This brings into question the legitimacy of Group P's possession of the land Henry lives on. If the deciding members of Group P own the property, Henry must be exiled. If they do not, Henry's property rights have been infringed by the offenders. First, we know Henry is the creator of the home and has homesteaded the area in which he stands. Henry did not enter a contract to transfer his ownership of the land to Group P, so Group P couldn't own it through voluntary means. Group P has effectively insisted by force that Henry's land belongs to them. Obviously, Group P is acting criminally. If a mafia were to take over your neighborhood by threatening everyone in it, you wouldn't claim the mafia legitimately owns the land they're possessing, by the definitions we've laid out at least. The member of Group P insists this isn't the case, but that Group P owned the land before Henry homesteaded it because Group P said that it was under their domain. This line of reasoning is also wrong because the members of Group P never mixed their labor with the land. Thus, it remained unowned until Henry homesteaded it. This situation is almost as if you walked up to Yosemite and shouted, "This is all mine now." This is obviously illegitimate. So, after all these reasons, we can finally come to the conclusion that Group P, despite allowing Henry a voice, like Patrick, has enslaved Henry. Now, too, we can be explicit with what this reasoning entails. In the original example, Patrick is a dictator. The example briefly stated that covering the group in which Henry had no say whatsoever is an oligarchy or technocracy. The final and most extensively covered example of Group P is a democracy. The member who defends Group P in argument is an agent of it, whether it be a police officer, an IRS agent, an ATF agent, or any other agent of the state. I prefer to think of the member as a local police officer. Henry is the individual subjugated under the state. if you make these substitutions at any point in the video, the logic holds. So, no matter which government you live under, you are enslaved. The police officer, now reasoning with you, has run out of reasons to defend the state's actions. As a result, he returns to the other agents of the state and explains to them their wrongdoing. However, most don't listen. Some don't have the faculty to reason. Others are good at theft and aren't at production, so they need to exploit others to try to make a living. Some want to hurt others and gain power over them. Others are afraid of the consequences they'll face in admitting their wrongdoing. And the remaining are afraid of the internal turmoil they'll face if they admit to themselves that they've been helping people murder, enslave, and torture other people. In good conscience, the agent you spoke to will leave the ranks of the state, refusing to further support their hegemony, but most will stay. Now that this section is complete, we can finally answer the question posed at the beginning of the video. Are we free? As long as we live under a state regime, no. To end this section on a semi-positive note, here's a quote from the great Hans Hermann Hoppe. A robber who is recognized and treated as such cannot last long. We live in anti-liberal times, when individual choice is highly suspect. The driving legislative ethos is toward making all actions required or forbidden, with less and less room for human volition. Simply put, we no longer trust the idea of freedom. We can't even imagine how it would work. What a distance we have traveled from the age of reason to our own times.
Dr. Fauci said that if hospitals get any more overcrowded, they're going to have to make some very tough choices about who gets an ICU bed. That choice doesn't seem so tough to me. Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
Amazon is directing some customers to ivermectin. That is a drug that is primarily used on animals like horses to prevent parasites.
As COVID cases continue to climb, GOP politicians are doubling down on their opposition to mask and vaccine mandates. On top of everything else, the FDA has to warn people not to take livestock dewormer.
FDA has been crystal clear. A horse dewormer should never be used to treat or try to prevent COVID-19. But that's not stopping popular podcaster Joe Rogan from pushing the drug. In fact, crediting it with helping him recover quickly from coronavirus.
Well, a new false cure for COVID in high demand. Ivermectin, a drug most commonly used to deworm large animals like horses, is selling out.
Are you a red-blooded, Hannity-watching, unvaccinated American? Are you taking the horse drug ivermectin to treat COVID?
I think we got him through this term. We would always show shots of him jogging, him in aviator shades, and like you paint him as a young geriatric. We were creating a story there that we didn't know anything about. You know, so that's I think that's propaganda. Look what we did. We got Trump out. I am 100% going to say it, and I 100% believe it, that if it wasn't for CNN, I don't know that Trump would have got voted out. Our focus was to get Trump out of office, right? Without saying it, that's what it was, right? So our next thing is going to be for climate change awareness.
Do you think it's going to be just like a lot of like fear, like climate?
Yeah, fear sells. Fear sells.
No one ever says those things out loud, but it's obvious.
And what is it you do?
Awkward sentence saying that CNN might in the future reserve the right to reveal the identity. It caused the hashtag CNN blackmail to start trending. John Avalon, the Daily Beast, you had a reporter write about this issue and about what we saw the alt-right sort of do to criticize CNN for it. What was your assessment of this?
Look, I think what's troubling and fascinating is the way that what Kristen just explained, which is a inflicit language added by an editor at the request of legal, all of a sudden got made and turned into a fictitious vision of playing the victim.
Is that your recollection?
Yes, it is, Don. That is accurate. In fact, Reince Priebus, who was then the Chief of Staff designate.
Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, is now a CNN national security analyst.
Or how to stop future attacks. Our next guest was present for part of that meeting, former Director of National Intelligence and CNN national security analyst James Clapper.
I was President Trump tonight claiming this is just the way it's done. Joining us now is former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper.
A yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
My name's Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA in Hawaii.
Talk a little bit about how the American surveillance state actually functions. Does it target the actions of Americans?
NSA and the intelligence community in general is focused on getting intelligence wherever it can by any means possible, but it believes on the grounds of sort of a self-certification that they serve the national interest. Originally, we saw that focus very narrowly tailored as foreign intelligence gathered overseas. Now, increasingly, we see that it's happening domestically. And to do that, the NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default. It collects them in its system, and it filters them, and it analyzes them, and it measures them, and it stores them for periods of time, simply because that's the easiest, most efficient, and most valuable way to achieve these ends.
Before Congress would require young women for the first time to register for the draft just like young men.
And the Senate Armed Services Committee wants women 18 to 25 to sign up with selective service just as men do.
Consequence, we are doing everything we can to focus in on certain sectors of our economy where that spread is more likely to occur, where that spread can be potentially more concentrated. With that, we have specifically targeted our efforts to close indoor operations. And I want to reinforce this, indoor. Look, can't say it enough, so I'll say it yet again. Please wear a face covering, wear a mask. We have now an unprecedented number of masks that have come into the state. We made a bold move to procure hundreds of millions of masks.
Today, the Department of Health and Human Services is issuing an epidemic order to help us slow the spread of COVID-19 and save lives. The order takes effect on Wednesday at 12:01 a.m. and will be in effect for 3 weeks, and we will continuously monitor the data throughout to determine next steps. Public health experts are warning Americans everywhere to limit our indoor gatherings so that we can save lives.
But in the meantime, what do we do today? We have to continue to stop the spread. This is a constant calibration also. I'm going to issue an executive order that says all people in public must have a mask or nose covering, mouth and nose covering, and they must wear it in a situation where you cannot or are not maintaining social distancing.
For members and staff that they will not be permitted to enter the hall of the House without wearing a mask. Masks will be available at the entry points for any member who forgets to bring one. The chair would also like to remind members that the Speaker has the authority to direct the Sergeant at Arms to remove a member from the floor as a matter of decorum. To reiterate, the chair views the failure to wear a mask as a serious breach of decorum.
It's all in the health order. The city of San Francisco forced gyms to close down months ago because of COVID-19, but now we're learning some city-owned gyms have been open and have been allowing city employees to work out indoors.
Well, that was news footage from June, just this June, when California Senator Dianne Feinstein wrote a letter to the FAA demanding everyone wear masks in airports. Feinstein wrote that we need a mandatory mask policy for all airport and airline employees and passengers, end quote.
And do PSA that everyone should wear a face mask. We all know that face masks.
Denver Mayor Michael Hancock says he will quarantine when he returns from his out-of-state holiday trip to see his family. It's actually a requirement for all city workers who leave the state. The mayor got caught leaving town after repeatedly telling the public to stay home and avoid travel this Thanksgiving.
The partial shutdown extended until December 20th. That means no indoor dining, in-person learning at high schools, or places of large gatherings like movie theaters.
We're one body. There's a mutuality and there's a recognition of our interdependence that requires of this moment that we direct a statewide order for people to stay at home.
We must do more to curtail community spread so our health system has a fighting chance. Today, I'm issuing a stay home, stay safe executive order.
On the businesses, on the valve, we reduced it to 50% of the workforce. We then reduced it to 75% of the workforce must stay home. And today we're bringing it to 100% of the workforce must stay home.
Und deshalb ist vollkommen klar, wir müssen handeln, und zwar jetzt. Und deshalb brauchen wir jetzt im Monat November, beginnend vom 2. November, noch einmal eine nationale Kraftanstrengung. Das bedeutet, der Aufenthalt in der Öffentlichkeit ist sofort nur mit den Angehörigen des eigenen und eines weiteren Hausstandes erlaubt. Alles geltend ab 2. November, maximal aber mit 10 Personen, aber immer nur aus 2 Hausständen. Veranstaltungen, die der Unterhaltung dienen, werden untersagt. Gastronomiebetriebe, Bars, Clubs, Diskotheken, Kneipen und ähnliche Einrichtungen werden geschlossen.
Après avoir échangé aussi avec tous nos partenaires européens et pesé le pour et le contre, j'ai décidé qu'il fallait retrouver à partir de vendredi le confinement qui a stoppé le virus.
Cases all in one household. More than one workplace, however, is involved. Contact tracing is underway. As of 12 noon tomorrow, Wednesday, August 12th, we will be moving Auckland to level 3 restrictions for a period of 3 days until midnight on Friday.
Washing your hands, staying 1.5 metres away from each other, only going out when you have to do the necessities and returning, and just doing simple things. This afternoon, people won't be going to the pub, but they'll be at home, just with their family, on their own, and they'll be FaceTiming and other things with their friends, and they'll be having those conversations through that method. It's a big change to our way of life.
That's why we've been asking people to stay at home during this pandemic. And though huge numbers are complying, and I thank you all, the time has now come for us all to do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home, because the critical thing we must do to stop the disease spreading between households. That is why people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. Shopping for basic necessities as infrequently as possible. One form of exercise a day, for example, a run, walk or cycle, alone or with members of your household. Any medical need to provide care or to help a vulnerable person, and travelling to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and cannot be done from home. That's all.
I want to begin by recognizing that a lot of people have now been stuck at home for a week or more because of COVID-19. If that's starting to take a toll, it's understandable. But we can't afford to stop now. I want to be clear. Social distancing, physical distancing, is the single best way to keep the people around you safe. We've all seen the pictures online of people who seem to think they're invincible. Well, you're not. Enough is enough. Go home and stay home. This is what we all need to be doing. And we're going to make sure this happens, whether by educating people more on the risks or by enforcing the rules, if that's needed.
And it's to Australia now, where an anti-lockdown protest in Melbourne has turned violent. Police arrested demonstrators and used pepper spray as hundreds of people took to the streets. Protesters say the lockdown is authoritarian and a way to deflect criticism of a vaccination program that has fallen far behind those of other countries.
The president is ordering nearly all federal workers and employees of contractors that do business with the federal government get vaccinated within 75 days, eliminating their option to be tested instead of getting shots. Employees who refuse could be punished, even fired.
If you want to work with the federal government and do business with us, get vaccinated.
While initially reluctant to issue mandates, the president's aggressive new plan requires vaccinations for 17 million healthcare workers at hospitals and other sites that receive Medicare or Medicaid funding. President Biden's now pressuring private companies too, directing the Labor Department to require businesses with 100 or more employees ensure their workers are fully vaccinated or provide a negative
nuclear bomb. He is so determined that he has made repeated covert attempts to acquire high-specification aluminum tubes from 11 different countries, even after inspections resumed. These tubes are controlled by the Nuclear Suppliers Group precisely because they can be used as centrifuges for enriching uranium. By now, just about everyone has heard of these tubes, and we all know that there are differences of opinion. There is controversy about what these tubes are for. Most U.S. experts think they are intended to serve as rotors in centrifuges used to enrich uranium. Other experts and the Iraqis themselves argue that they are really to produce the rocket bodies for a conventional weapon, a multiple rocket launcher. Let me tell you what is not controversial about these tubes. First, all the experts who have analyzed the tubes in our possession agree that they can be adapted for centrifuge use. Second, Iraq had no business. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax. But UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material. And that is my third point, and it is key. Mounted on road trailer units and on rail cars. Finally, a fourth source, an Iraqi major who defected, confirmed that Iraq has mobile biological research laboratories in addition to the production facilities I mentioned earlier. We have diagrammed what our sources reported about these mobile facilities. Here you see both truck and rail car mounted mobile factories. The description our sources gave us of the technical features required by such facilities.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Today, I authorize the Armed Forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya.
So obviously a lot of these strikes have been in the Fatah and going after al-Qaeda suspects who are up in very tough terrain along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
That's why last weekend I announced that as Commander-in-Chief, I decided that the United States should take military action against the Syrian regime.
If there's a connection somehow with al-Qaeda, now to Somalia. We know the US has recently increased its on-the-ground military activity against al-Shabaab forces in support of Somali and African Union forces.
The White House has already committed significant assistance. The U.S. military is helping the Saudis plan bombing missions over Yemen, providing targeting intelligence from satellites overhead, and making AWACS surveillance planes and aerial refueling aircraft available as well.
What action did the U.S. undertake and what happened?
Well, it was quite a large air raid consisting of 20 airstrikes by both manned jet fighters and unmanned drones against several al-Qaeda base camps in central Yemen, a remote mountainous area. The strikes are believed to have killed several fighters and destroyed some weapons caches and equipment, and also killed one.
The guy the Biden administration droned, was he an aid worker or an ISIS-K operative?
The administration is, of course, reviewing that strike, and I'm sure that full assessment will be
So
forthcoming.
you don't know if it was an aid worker or an ISIS-K operative?
I can't speak to that, and I can't speak to that in this setting in any event.
So you don't know or won't tell us?
I don't know because we're reviewing it.
Well, see, you'd think you'd kind of know before you off somebody with a Predator drone, whether he's an aid worker or he's an ISIS-K. See, the thing is this isn't just you. It's been going on for administration after administration.
We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin. If they'll not help, if these governors won't help us beat the pandemic, I'll use my power as president to get them out of the way.
I think a lot of times people don't have a really positive image of the government, and what the government does.
Truth is treason in the empire of lies. This video was created such that each portion is supposed to be viewable without having to listen to the other parts. That said, I hope you watch the whole thing. So to summarize, the hierarchy of tyranny separates people into different groups: the cultural tyrants, the majority, and the non-complicit. The cultural tyrants want power over you, or are okay with using force as means to achieve their ends. The majority follow the cultural tyrants as they either have no capability to think independently, or they just cave to the societal pressure caused by those tyrants. Due to the unique powers of the state, the cultural tyrants are rewarded if they join said state, or support it. Thus, the state is largely made up of these tyrants. The legal shows that the documents drafted by the state will not be adhered to. Those who make up the state care very little about the documents supposedly limiting their abilities. They will purposefully misinterpret language in these documents to bypass their quote-unquote limitations, and they will almost always get away with it. Economics first provides the framework of a voluntary society with peaceful participants, and then introduces an actor with a monopoly on legislation, execution, and arbitration, and with the ability to coerce its revenue from an unwilling group of people. It also provides some reasoning as to why the stated monopoly entity couldn't serve people efficiently, even if it ignored the incentives described. Ethics argues that people own themselves and the things that they create. As a result of this ownership, they have the rightful ability to transfer the title of that ownership as they see fit. However, since coercion can be used on a rightful owner of property, someone may illegitimately possess a given thing. Ethics explores how one can derive the way in which one gains property when the action used to gain possession is unknown. When that action is proven to be involuntary, the offender, whether a single person or group, is acting illegitimately, sometimes as a slave owner. What's happening now provides receipts for all of the above. It gives numerous examples as to how the state and its apparatchiks cheat, lie, steal, and murder to meet their ends, trampling over their limitations and acting as slave owners in the process. So, what can you or I do about this? The state is seemingly all-powerful, as states have existed for thousands of years, and they continue to get away with abusing mass populations. This is a very reasonable question to ask, and there's no clear answer. There's still debate on the proper strategy to this day. There are a bunch of strategies people have offered, and each of those strategies and their details would have to be in their own video. That said, these are some steps I believe that any individual who wants to promote liberty can take to fight tyranny. For one, support secessionist movements. That support can be political participation and involvement on a local level, or just mere word of mouth. Secession reduces the power of the state apparatus through reducing its geographical monopoly, allowing for more quote-unquote competition, and thus creating a larger incentive for states to care about their slaves' well-being. Secession can and should be peaceful and nonviolent. Secondly, if you're going to argue with somebody on the left, stop using their terms. When those on the evangelical left call you racist and you respond with, "No, I'm not racist," and then explain how you aren't racist, or "No, I'm not racist, you're racist," and then explain how they're racist, you are playing into their hands. When they use these terms, this is a sign that they don't know how to respond to your arguments, as they've run out of talking points they've read on the 3x5 index card of allowable opinion. Their overlords haven't told them of this criticism before, so they respond in the only way they know how. At this point, understand the argument is over. Do not entertain them by playing on their field. They'll use all kinds of keywords to do this. Words like anti-vaxxer, anti-masker, Trump supporter, conspiracy theorist, etc. These terms are also indicators that the person you're attempting to argue with is unable to think in the way you are. Third, know who you're arguing with. This varies from person to person, but there are good indicators as to who is worth having a discussion with. Don't try to argue with more than 2 people at once, you'll get nowhere. The group they're with will reinforce their beliefs through societal pressure, which is what you're attempting to break them from in the first place. You don't want to put them into an environment where they will not change their opinion. The only way to do this is through one-on-one conversation. Also, know where the person is coming from. The arguments you should use to attempt to change a Marxist mind is different from those used on a neoliberal, is different from a neoconservative, is different from a paleoconservative. Personally, I find that those more extreme in their beliefs are more reasonable because they've demonstrated that they will break the social pressure if there is a belief they find to be reasonable. However, that indicator isn't fantastic because that extremism could just be ideological fanaticism, which can be even harder to break than societal pressure. So again, it really depends on who you're arguing with. Also, know when the argument is over. If someone has practically admitted to your point, there's no reason to continue. Stop while you're ahead. If someone is using the evangelical left's terms, there's no reason to continue. When someone says, "Let's agree to disagree," there's no reason to continue. Those last two are set in their beliefs with or without your input. There's nothing you can do. Finally, do not comply with the state's edicts. That said, don't turn to violence, even if it's retaliatory. The police or other state agents will hurt you, and it's better you stay alive and well than beaten or killed by agents of the state. However, you can choose not to get vaccinated. You can choose not to wear a mask. You can choose not to go to places that comply with the state's edicts. Although we've argued that this argument has been used to justify the existence of the state as wrong, you can choose to move to a small s state with more relaxed or no edicts at all to avoid the federal state's criminal interference on you and yours. Do what is best for you. So, over the course of the video, we can now say, the state is made up of people who wish to do you harm. The state cannot be trusted to act in good faith and cannot be trusted to remain limited. The state is incentivized to make decisions to harm you for its own benefit, and even if the state wanted to help you, it doesn't even have the capability to. As long as the state exists, you are enslaved by it. And finally, the state is actively and obviously displaying itself as your slave owner. The clear outcome of the summation of all of these derived statements is the existence of the state is anti-liberty, anti-individual, and thus anti-human. Therefore, it must be abolished. Libertarianism is cultish, say the sophisticates. Of course, there's nothing cultish at all about allegiance to the state, with its flags, its songs, its mass murders, its little children saluting and paying homage to pictures of their dear leaders on the wall. Alrighty, well now that the video's over, I want to thank you for watching it. It took a while to make, so I'd appreciate any interaction with the video, whether that be likes, subscribers, comments, or etc. If you have any suggestions for future videos or criticisms on this video, just let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to them. Essentially, this section is going to be really quick. I just want to list a bunch of content creators / personalities / scholars to check out if you want more detailed information on these and more topics. So as for content creators, I check out e.t.c, Ubersoy, Bitbutter, and Liquid Zulu. Bitbutter and Liquid Zulu both make great anarcho-capitalist focused content. Liquid Zulu makes these shorter style videos. Sometimes he'll debate people, but he makes these great videos focusing on the philosophies of different people. A lot of debunking stuff too. Bitbutter has these amazing animations, and they're short, very well done. They're clean, they're easy to watch, and they really hammer home the concepts in a very short amount of time. Ubersoy isn't an anarcho-capitalist or anything. He's not even an Austrian person. I'm pretty sure he calls himself a Keynesian, but he makes these great culture-focused videos. And then e.t.c has hundreds of videos on World War II, plus his videos on Hitler's socialism, Mussolini's fascism, and his video on private versus public property are especially fantastic. For the rest of the people that I'm going to list here, if you haven't heard of them, just throw their name in Google. They've all had their own contributions to the cause of liberty, far, far more than I have or probably ever will. Ludwig von Mises, Eugen von Bambalwerk, Karl Menger, Henry Hazlitt, F.A. Hayek, Bob Murphy, Murray Rothbard, Hans Hermann Hoppe, Lou Rockwell, Walter Block, Tom Woods, Michael Malice, Dave Smith, Ron Paul, Eric July, Scott Horton, Daniel McAdams, Jeff Deist, Ryan McMakin, Tom DiLorenzo, Joe Salerno, Per Byland, Andrew Napolitano, Pete Quinones, Michael Bolden, and Stephen Kinsella. I'd also recommend checking out the Foundation for Economic Education. It's also called FEE, F-E-E, the 10th Amendment Center, the Mises Institute, and the Property and Freedom Society. So there's also a ton of different libertarian podcasts to check out. There's a whole wealth of them out there. But other than the ones created by some of the names listed above, like the Tom Woods Show, there's You're Welcome, there's Part of the Problem. I also recommend listening to Lines of Liberty, Break the Cycle, Hotep Jesus, and Hotep Nation, and Tower Power Hour. Once again, thanks for watching.